Within 10 seconds of holding the divorce certificate in my hand, I canceled all 8 of my mother-in-law's authorized user platinum credit cards. Just as my ex-husband's family was about to make the down payment and furnish a condo for his sister, a notification from the bank left them all stunned. On the worn wooden table of the county courthouse clerk's office, the divorce decree landed with a dry, short, and decisive thud. It felt like a sharp slap across the face of my 3 years of youth. I stared at the 2 words, dissolution of marriage, freshly stamped in black ink. They were still warm, the smell of the ink not yet faded. For some reason, my mind began to count. 1, 2, 3, 10 seconds. In just 10 seconds, I was officially no longer Jacob's wife. The man sitting across from me still had his head down, finishing his signature on the final line. His handwriting was so familiar I could recognize it with my eyes closed. After 3 years of marriage, I knew him too. Well, I knew his every little habit, every furrow of his brow, every moment of his silence. He was the type of man who had a problem but dared not speak, an opinion but dared not argue. Everything had to be according to his mother's will. And that mother, Carol, was now standing behind Jacob. The corners of her lips were curled into a smirk she tried to hide, but failed miserably. It was a smile I knew all too well. The smile of a seasoned gambler who had just won a big hand. Well, that's done. Pack your things and get out. Carol's voice came from above. My head, as cold as morning well water. What a waste of time. You're divorced. Now, don't stand here being an eyesore. I didn't look at her. I didn't even need to. I knew what her gaze was like right now. Like shooing a stray dog from the doorstep. I quietly opened my bag and took out my phone. Jacob only now lifted his head to look at me. His lips moved as if he wanted to say something, but he swallowed it back down. He was still the same. Hesitant, weak, and indecisive. 3 years, and nothing had changed. Enough was enough. It was time to go. Carol tugged at Jacob's arm. Her voice sounded impatient. This afternoon, we still have to put the down payment on Heather's condo. Let's not be late. Heather, Jacob's sister, quickly came over and linked her arm with her mother's, a sweet smile on her face. Don't worry, Mom. I've already told the developer. We'll be there by 3 p.m. The escrow closes this afternoon, and the condo is ours. Yes, I know. Carol patted her designer handbag. I brought all 8 cards, more than enough for the full payment. After saying that, she shot me a look. A look full of meaning. I understood. It was a look of showing off. For all these years, every time she swiped my card, why had she never given me a look like that? My phone screen lit up. I opened my banking app, logged in with Face ID. It all happened in a matter of seconds. My finger tapped on a familiar line. It was Carol A. Thompson's authorized user card. I pressed the option to cancel. Confirm, ping. My phone vibrated slightly. A notification popped up. The authorized user card has been successfully cancelled. Meanwhile, Carol was still rummaging through her purse, muttering, which card should I use? This one has a high limit. I said nothing. I continued. Cancelled the second card. Ping. The third. Cancelled. Ping. The fourth. Cancelled. Ping. The successive notification sounds were as steady as a heartbeat, but they slowly made the atmosphere in the room strange. Jacob started to frown. He looked at me, then at his mother, then at his own phone. Alara, what are you doing? I didn't answer. My finger kept moving. The 5th card, the 6th, the 7th. Ping, ping, ping. When I reached the 8th card, I paused for a moment, then pressed confirm. Ping. The clean sweep was complete in under 3 minutes. Carol finally pulled out a platinum credit card, turned it over, then pulled out another. Her expression began to change. What's wrong with this? She handed the card to Jacob. The card won't swipe. Jacob took it, checked it, then opened the Pricey app on his phone. A few seconds later, his face turned pale. He turned to look at me. Alara, did you lock my mom's cards? I looked up at him and smiled. A very faint smile. They aren't her cards. I held up my phone. They're my cards. My cards? Whether I lock them or not is my right. Is there a problem? Carol felt as if She'd been struck by lightning. What are you talking about? Those are my cards, I've been using them for 3 years. It's true, you've been using them. I turned my phone screen towards her. But I've been the primary cardholder for 3 years, and all the credit cards you carry are in my name. Every single dollar you've spent was my money. The room fell silent. Heather stood beside them, a forced smile frozen on her face. Jacob stood there like a statue. Carol opened her mouth but couldn't speak. A few seconds later, Heather was the first to react. Are you insane? You've been using those cards for years. You can't just block them whenever you feel like it. I stood up and closed my bag. Yes, I can. We're divorced. Your family and I are no longer related. They're my cards. Why should you get to use them? Jacob finally stepped forward. His voice sounded panicked. Alara, this is going too far. I need that money for the house. How about you unlock the cards? We'll talk about it later. I laughed. Not a happy laugh, but a bitter one. We'll talk about it later. For the past 3 years, every time we argued, the answer was always later. Every time your mother crossed the line, the answer was later. Every time I was at my breaking point, the answer was later. Listen, Jacob. I turned my head away. I've bowed my head for 3 years. My neck has started to hurt. I held up the divorce decree in front of his face. Look at this. From today onward, there is no later. Go on, Jacob. I'm leaving. You want to buy a house for your sister, and your mother wants to go shopping. None of that has anything to do with me anymore. Carol suddenly shrieked, her face a mask of ingratitude. Marrying my son was the best thing that ever happened to you. Even though we're divorced, you still want to ruin our path. Are you even human? For the first time in 3 years, I looked at her. I looked directly into her eyes. Your path. For the past 3 years, who paved the way? For your family? Who paid the mortgage on the house you live in? Who paid for the Lexus you drive? Your son's business losses amounted to $500,000. Who covered all of it? I did. All of it was me. Every word was like a nail hammered into their hearts. Heather trembled, saying, we have to make a $50,000 down payment for the condo and the new furniture this afternoon, or we lose the unit. Jacob was silent for a long time. Then he looked at me and asked a question. How much more do you want to reopen them? I laughed. This time, it was a real laugh. He thought I was negotiating. I'm not opening them. I wouldn't open them for any amount of money. Don't expect your family to get another cent from me. I turned around. The sound of my heels clicked on the marble floor. Click, clack, click. Each step was light but firm. Behind me, a chaotic mix of curses, crying, and my name being called. But I didn't look back. Stepping out of the courthouse, the sun hit my face. It was warm. As clear as a new beginning. My phone vibrated. The final notification. The 8th card has been successfully cancelled. I took a deep breath. I had been patient for 3 years. But this was just the beginning. The taxi pulled away from the courthouse entrance. The car's tires hissed softly on the asphalt. The sound wasn't loud, but it was enough for me to feel clearly that I had just left something behind. Not a DTT person, not a relationship, but an entire chapter of my life, a chapter I once thought would last forever. It all ended with a piece of paper and a few official stamps. I leaned my head against the window, watching the city outside seem to move backward. Cars jostled for space, hurried faces flashed by. Everything was business as usual. No one knew that inside this small taxi was a woman who had just escaped a marriage, who had just broken every chain that had bound her for 3 years. And no one knew that in my purse, 8 credit cards, cancelled in just 3 minutes, had officially thrown another family into chaos. The phone in my bag buzzed incessantly. It vibrated so hard my entire bag shook. I didn't need to look. I already knew who was calling. Because right now, in this world, there was only one person who would call me so relentlessly. And only one person who would panic upon realizing their regular source of income had been cut off. I didn't answer. I let the phone vibrate. Once, twice, 5 times, 10 times. Then it switched to a barrage of text message. I opened them, not to read, but to see what they would say when they're composed. Facade finally cracked. Alara, what's the point of this? Don't joke around, open the cards back up. The payment is due this afternoon, you know that, right? I scrolled through the messages without replying. The next one came quickly. This time, the tone was different. Ilara, I'm at the sales office with Mom. Everyone is waiting. Just unblock them for now. Whatever the issue is, we can talk about it later. There it was again, later. I smiled faintly. The taxi driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror, probably surprised to see me smiling to myself. But he didn't ask, just remained silent and kept driving. That was more comforting than any question. The car turned onto the expressway. The sunlight made me squint. Just then, a new message popped up. Ilara, Mom is crying out here. Are you happy seeing her like this? I stared at the message for a few seconds, then typed a reply. Yes. Just one word. Sent. Then, I blocked his number immediately. No hesitation, no regrets, no looking back. The phone fell silent. The car suddenly felt so quiet I could hear my own breathing. A light but steady breath, as if a great weight had been lifted from my chest. Just got divorced, ma'am? The taxi driver suddenly asked. His tone wasn't nosy, just a casual observation. I wasn't surprised. Anyone looking at me right now could probably guess. Yes, sir. He nodded, saying nothing more. A moment later, he offered a small smile. You look happier than some people on their wedding day. I turned to him and smiled back. Because I am, sir. The car continued on. I gave him my friend's address. My voice was light, as if I had just shed a heavy burden. But elsewhere, in the city, the atmosphere was the complete opposite. The sales gallery of a luxury condo project was still air-conditioned to a low temperature. The bright white lights reflected off the polished marble floors, creating sharp silhouettes of the people inside. But no matter how cold the air was, sweat was trickling down Carol's back. She stood before the payment counter, her hand tightly gripping a platinum credit card. Her palm was so clammy the card nearly slipped from her grasp. But what terrified her wasn't the sweat, but the look in the sales agent's eyes. A polite but distant look, as if she had gone from being a client to a liability. I'm very sorry, ma'am, but this card isn't going through. The agent said softly, his professional smile still in place. Impossible. Carol slammed her hand on the counter. Her voice grew higher. I've used this card for 3 years, never had a problem. Our system shows this. Authorized user card has been blocked. Ma'am, what do you mean blocked? Try it. Again. The agent tried again. Once, twice, 3 times. The result was the same. I'm very sorry, ma'am. It still declined. Heather, standing beside her with a pale face, hastily pulled all the cards out of the purse and piled them on the 5 counter. Her voice trembled. Try all of them, please, all of them. One by one, the cards were swiped. Each swipe, each cold, electronic beep, was followed by failure. The atmosphere in the room began to shift. Other clients who were looking at models slowly turned their heads. Their eyes were filled with curiosity, mixed with a hint of ridicule. Jacob stood behind them, his fists clenched, his face flushed. He knew what was happening, but he didn't know what to do. Because for the first time in 3 years, he realized the woman he had always assumed would give, was no longer in a position to do so. Call Alara. Heather tugged at her brother's arm, her voice almost a sob. Call her. Jacob picked up his phone and dialed the number, but it didn't go through. The number was blocked. He switched to his mother's phone. It rang. Once, twice, before it connected. Ilara, he said. Yes, what is it? The voice on the other end was so calm, it made Jacob choke. Can you please unblock the cards? Jacob said quickly, as if afraid a second's delay would lose him the chance. Heather needs to pay for her apartment. There was a slight pause, then she asked, what does that have to do with me? It was a simple question, but it felt like a knife to the heart. Jacob was speechless, unable to answer, because he knew the answer was nothing. Alara, don't be like this. You've helped my family so much for 3 years, please, just help us one more time. I laughed, but this time my voice was colder. 3 years. It's precisely because it has been 3 years that I'm stopping. Ask yourself this. If I didn't stop, How much longer would this go on? The line was silent, filled only with his heavy breathing. I said it one last time. Those 8 cards are mine. I am locking them, and I am not opening them again. I hung up without waiting for him to say more. Jacob stood frozen in the middle of the sales office, his phone still pressed to his ear. The people around him had moved from curiosity to a kind of pitying sympathy, and that silence was more terrifying than any mockery. What is it? Carol came closer. What did she say? Jacob lowered the phone. His voice was hoarse. She won't open them. Just 4 words, but they were enough to make their world crumble. Heather burst into tears. Carol sank weakly into a file chair, and Jacob, for the first time in his life, felt he was no longer a mediator between 2 sides, but someone left behind. And that's when he began to understand something. Some things, once lost, can never be regained. The atmosphere in the sales office was no longer just tense. It had become heavy and suffocating. It was like the quiet before a storm, when everything is still, but everyone knows a single bolt of lightning will make everything explode. And the scariest part was, the lightning wasn't coming from outside, but from within the room itself. Jacob still stood in the same spot. The phone in his hand had long gone dark, but he still gripped it as if it were the only thing he could hold on to. His gaze was no longer on anyone, but fixed on the marble floor, where his reflection was so strangely distorted that he barely recognized himself. Meanwhile, Carol sat on the chair, her back slumped, her hands on her lap, but her fingers kept clenching and unclenching, as if trying to suppress an uncontrollable tremor. What do you mean, she won't open them? Carol's beckoned. Carol's voice was raspy, stripped of its usual cold authority, replaced by sheer panic. Jacob didn't answer right away. Because he didn't know how to explain it. Or rather, he didn't want to admit what he had just heard. From now on, the woman who had shouldered the entire family would no longer do so. Not because she had run out of money, but because she had chosen not to anymore. She said she will never open them again. Jacob finally said. His voice was so low that if not for the silence in the room, no one might have heard. Heather, standing beside him with red, mascara-streaked eyes, grabbed Jacob's arm. Her voice trembled. What did she say? She must be joking, right? Jacob shook his head. It was just a slight shake, but it was enough to drain all the strength from Heather. She let go of his arm, took a step back, and slumped into a chair. Tears streamed down her face uncontrollably. Because she knew this wasn't a joke. From her former sister-in-law. This was the first time in her life someone had actually said, no. It can't be. It just can't be. Heather mumbled. Her gaze was empty. She was never like this before. She always helped. A very sincere, very naive statement, but it made a few people nearby exchange glances. Because in that statement, there was not a shred of gratitude. Only the assumption that others should help, should give, should carry the burden. As if it were a natural obligation. The agent at the counter maintained her professional smile, but her eyes began to change. It was no longer just politeness, but a bit of observation, judgment, and anticipation of how this drama would end. I'm sorry, ma'am. If the payment isn't made, we can only hold this unit until 5 p.m. today, she said softly, but every word was clear. After that, we will have to release it to other customers. It was a gentle reminder, but it hit Carol at her weakest point. She suddenly stood up, her voice rising. What's the holdup? I already said I would pay in full this afternoon. Yes, ma'am. But we can only confirm once the funds are in the company's account. The reply was still polite, but uncompromising. Carol turned to Jacob, her eyes red. Call her again, tell her to unlock the cards. Tell her whatever she wants. I'll give it to her. Jacob stood still, not moving. It wasn't that he didn't want to call, but he knew it was futile. However, under the gaze of his mother and sister, he still picked up the phone. Even though in his heart, he knew this call wasn't to solve the problem, but just to cling to a sliver of hope. He opened his contacts and stared at Alara, the name he had been so used to calling, so used to relying on for the past 3 years. But today, that name felt so foreign. It took him a few seconds to gather the courage to press the call button. The call connected, but this time, there was no calm voice as before. Why are you still calling? My voice was audible, not loud, not shouting, but it was enough to make him choke. Elara, listen, I said. No need to interrupt me. Just listen. A moment of silence, but a heavy one. You want me to reopen the cards, don't you? Jacob didn't answer, but his breathing was the answer. Then let me ask you something. In the past 3 years, have I ever said no? Jacob was silent. Never. Whatever your mother wanted to buy, I paid. Even when your sister went shopping, I never questioned it. I absorbed the losses from your business ventures. My voice was even, not fast, not slow, but every word was clear. Now, try to answer this. Don't I have the right to say no, just once? Jacob stood frozen. Because he didn't know how to answer that question. From now on, you're on your own. I hung up immediately. No chance for him to say more, no chance to explain, no chance to beg. On the other end, Jacob was still holding the phone. But this time, his hand was genuinely shaking. Not because he was angry, but because for the first time, he realized that the woman he thought would always be there for him was truly gone. What is it? Carol asked again. This time, more urgently. What did she say? Jacob lowered the phone, looked at his mother and sister, and uttered a sentence he never thought he would say. She doesn't owe us anything. It wasn't that she refused or was unwilling, but that she simply owed us nothing at all. That sentence made Carol freeze. It was as if for the first time, someone had spoken a truth she had deliberately ignored. What are you saying? Her eyes widened. How can she not owe us anything? She ate at our house for 3 years, used all our facilities. Jacob laughed. It was a very strange laugh. Not happy, not bitter, but like the laugh of someone who has realized something far too late. Our house, he repeated. Which house, Mom? Whose name is this apartment in? Do you remember whose name is on the title of the car you drive every day? Who owns the 8 credit cards you've been using? With each question, his voice grew deeper. Not loud, but enough to make the listener unable to escape. Carol opened her mouth, but couldn't speak. Lita was also silent. For the first time in years, no one argued. Because the answer was too obvious. It didn't need to be said, didn't need to be explained, silence was enough. The agent at the counter glanced at the clock and politely reminded them again. Excuse me, it's almost 5 p.m. You have about an hour left. An hour. Just 1 hour. But for the 3 of them, that time was already gone. It was a gap that could never be filled. Lita covered her face and cried. Carol sat down listlessly, and Jacob, for the first time in his life, didn't look at his mother or his sister. He stared at the empty space in front of him, where there had always been someone silently shouldering everything. But now, that space was empty. And it was then he understood that not all goodbyes are loud. Some people, just by letting go, can make everything else collapse. The time in that sales office seemed to pass very slowly. It felt as if every minute, every second was deliberately stretched out, so that the people inside could feel the overwhelming stalemate more acutely. For Jacob, Carol, and Heather, each tick of the clock was like a knife cut, deepening their growing fear. Because they weren't just losing a condo, they were slowly realizing that the support they thought was unshakable was truly gone. Heather still sat with her face covered. Her sobs were choked in her throat, her shoulders shaking. But strangely, no one in the room came to comfort her. Because now, all the gazes had changed, no longer just curious, but scrutinizing, judging, understanding, and even a little dismissive. Carol, who was sitting next to her, had stopped crying. She became strangely silent. Her eyes stared at the floor, as if trying to find an escape route among the cold marble patterns. But the more she looked, the more she realized there was no escape. Because she had never imagined she would have to fend for herself. This can't go on, she muttered, her voice hoarse. We can't let that woman get her way. Jacob, standing nearby, heard her but said nothing, because he didn't know how to react. On one hand, it was the truth he had just realized. On the other, it was the ingrained habit of always siding with his mother. Call her again. Carol suddenly lifted her head. Her eyes were red. Tell her to come here. Let's talk face to face. Jacob frowned. What's the point of her coming here, Mom? So she can see this situation. Her heart will soften. Carol's voice became more confident, as if she had found a solution. That woman, I know her. She looks tough on the outside, but her heart is soft. Just seeing her sister cry, seeing her mother in distress, she'll definitely give in. It was a very familiar logic. A line of thought she had used for the Tarius past 3 years, and it had always worked. But this time, Jacob didn't believe it. He stood still for a few seconds, then picked up his phone. Because in this situation, he had no other choice. He opened his block list, unblocked my number, and pressed call. It rang once, twice, longer than usual, before connecting. What is it? My voice came through. Not surprised at all, as if I had expected this call. Jacob took a breath, trying to keep his voice steady. Alara, can you come to the sales office for a moment? I didn't answer immediately. There was a pause, but it was enough to make him feel the pressure. Why? I want to talk to you in person. Mom and Heather are here too. I chuckled softly. A laugh that wasn't loud, but was clear. Do you think I have anything left to discuss with your family? Jacob gripped the phone tighter. Just this once. Please. The word please had just been spoken. Jacob himself found it strange, because he hadn't needed to use that word with me in 3 years. There was a few seconds of silence on my end, then I said, fine, what's the address? Jacob read it out quickly. I said nothing more and hung up. He stood there for a moment, then turned to his mother. She's coming. Carol let out a sigh of relief, as if she had just grabbed a lifeline. See? What did I tell you? As long as we meet face to face, everything will be fine. But none of the 3 of them knew that my decision to come wasn't to compromise, but to end everything. About 20 minutes later, the glass door of the sales office opened. The sound of high heels echoed steadily on the marble floor. Not fast, not rushed. Every step was firm. I walked in, wearing a cream-colored trench coat, my hair neatly down my back. My face was so calm that everyone in the room instinctively fell silent. Because that calmness was not a weakness, but the kind of confidence that only someone who has everything under control can have. Carol's eyes immediately locked onto mine. Heather also looked up, her tears not yet dry. Jacob stood there, staring at me, but didn't come closer. I didn't look at them first. I went straight to the counter, put my bag down, and nodded at the agent. Good afternoon. My voice was soft and polite, like a regular customer. The agent nodded back, a little surprised by my demeanor. Only then did I turn to look at the 3 of them. My gaze lingered for a moment, but no longer. What did you call me here for? Carol immediately stood up and came closer. Her tone had become gentle and soft. If this had happened 3 years ago, I might have believed it. Alara, you're here. Sit down, dear. No need to sit. What is it? Just tell me. Carol was stunned for a moment, but then continued. I know. I might have spoken harshly to you before, but it was all because I was worried about my family. Heather really needs this condo right now. Can you help your sister out this one time? Her voice trembled, sounding very convincing. But I just stared at her, without reacting. Jacob, standing next to her, spoke up. Alara, I know you're angry, but this is about my sister's home. Help me out this one time. I guarantee it. Guarantee what? I interrupted. Not loudly, but clearly. Jacob fell silent, unable to answer because he himself didn't know what he was trying to guarantee. I turned to Heather, who was crying, her eyes full of hope. Please, just help me this one time. I promise I won't bother you again. A familiar line. All too familiar. I took a deep breath, then opened my handbag, took out a stack of papers, and placed them on the counter. Before we talk about helping or not, let's talk about this. Carol frowned. What are those papers? For the past 3 years, I said in a steady voice, this is a detailed breakdown of what you and Jacob's sister have spent using my cards. The room fell silent. I flipped to the first page. 45,000 for a fur coat, 1,500 for a spa package, 2,000 at the casino, 10,000 for a vacation. Every number, every item was clearly listed, down to the last dollar. With every word I spoke, Carol's expression changed slightly. Heather gradually stopped crying. Jacob just stood there, frozen. The grand total, which I read from the last page, was $1,283,000. No one said anything, because no one could deny it. You, Carol stammered. Where did you get all this from? Without looking. I looked her straight in the eye. It came from my account statements. Of course, I have the right to know. There was a moment of silence. Then I continued. And now you want me to help you with another $50,000 for a house? I asked just one question. I slowly looked at each of them. On what grounds are you asking? No one answered. No one dared to look me in the eye. The entire room was silent. I could only hear the hum of the air conditioner and my own steady heartbeat. I picked up the stack of papers, put them back in my bag, and looked at them one last time. I've done enough for 3 years, the rest is on you. I turned and walked away, not stopping, not looking back. And this time, no one called after me. The glass door behind me closed very gently, almost without a sound. But for those left inside, that sound was a clear, definitive, and irreversible end. Because as soon as my figure disappeared from view, the atmosphere in the sales gallery sank into a suffocating silence. It wasn't a peaceful silence, but the kind where everyone feels that everything has just collapsed before their eyes. It's just that no one had the courage to say it out loud. Jacob still stood there, his hands hanging limp at his sides, his eyes fixed on the closed door. It seemed that even at that moment, he couldn't believe that I had really left. Without looking back, without softening my tone, without leaving any crack for him to slip through as usual. Meanwhile, Carol stood frozen in the middle of the room, her face going from flushed to pale, then from pale to ashen. Her lips were pressed into a thin line. It was as if she was trying to swallow the anger that was about to erupt, but couldn't find an outlet. Heather was still sitting, but her tears had stopped. Not because she had calmed down, but because she was beginning to understand that crying was useless now. The agent at the counter politely turned away from the scene and cleared his throat softly. His voice was still professional, but now carried the firmness of someone accustomed to these situations. I'm very sorry, but we still haven't received the payment. As a reminder, we are only holding the unit until 5 p.m. The sentence was very gentle, but it was like a final blow. Carol spun around, her eyes blazing. Can't you see I'm trying? I already said I'd pay. The employee didn't back down, maintaining a polite distance. His voice was calm. I understand, ma'am. But we need confirmation of the funds in our account before we can secure the unit. Please understand. The 2 words, please understand, were spoken softly but coldly. It wasn't an apology, but a reminder that rules were rules. No exceptions. Heather suddenly stood up, her voice choked. Mom, what do we do now? She managed to say a few words. Heather, I don't have the money, how can I pay? Carol didn't answer right away. She turned to Jacob. Her eyes were full of pressure. Call her again. Tell her to come back. Just tell her to unlock 1 card. I don't need any more help. Jacob didn't move. A second, 2 seconds, then he shook his head. A very slow, but firm shake. I can't, Mom. His voice was hoarse. She's not coming back. Carol couldn't believe her ears. What did you say? What did you just say? You're not going to call. Jacob lifted his head. For the first time, he looked directly at his mother. His gaze was no longer evasive, no longer hesitant. Enough, Mom. Just 2 words, spoken softly but with great weight. The entire room fell. Silence. Heather was also stunned. Carol glared at him. Enough of what? What are you talking about? Jacob took a deep breath. As if he had been holding it for too long. When he exhaled, his voice was no longer normal. 3 years, Mom. Isn't that enough? How much more do you want to take from her? The more words he spoke, the more tense the atmosphere became. Carol was speechless, as if she never expected her son to say that. Are you defending her? Have you forgotten who she is? Have you forgotten she ate in our house for 3 years? Jacob laughed. A very faint laugh, but full of exhaustion. Ate in our house, he repeated. Which house is our house, Mom? Whose name is this apartment in? Who pays the monthly mortgage? Who bought the car you're using? Whose name is on the credit cards you use? Each question was no longer spoken softly, but clearly and coherently. Not a single pause. No evasion. Carol opened her mouth, but couldn't speak. Heather stared at her brother, her eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and fear. As if she was seeing a different side of her brother for the first time. Jacob, what are you doing? Heather trembled. Why are you saying that? Jacob didn't look at her, just said, I'm just telling the truth. Just one sentence that silenced everything. The cashier glanced at the clock and spoke up again. This time, there were no polite greetings. Excuse me, it's 4:45 p.m. There are only 15 minutes left to hold the unit. Please make a decision. 15 minutes was a concrete number. But for the three of them now, it was an insurmountable distance. Heather suddenly burst into sobs again. This time, she didn't hold back. Approaching and grabbing Jacob's arm. Jacob, do something. Help me. You can't let me lose this condo. Jacob stood still, not pushing her away, but not responding either. Help me, Jacob. I don't want to lose it. Heather's voice trembled, but Jacob just looked at her and said very slowly, Heather, I can't help. It's not that I don't want to, but I can't. Because, for the first time, I understand that I never had that ability. It's just that someone else was always doing it for me. Carol erupted at that moment. She stood up abruptly. Her voice was shrill. If you can't help, then borrow. Where are your friends? Where are your connections? Are you a man who can't even take care of his own sister? Jacob clenched his fists. His nails dug into his palms. It hurt, but not as much as what he was hearing. I've already called, he said. No one is willing to lend me anything. A sincere confession, without any concealment or excuses. Carol froze. Heather also fell silent. Not because she didn't want to speak, but because she didn't know what else to say. Because at this moment, they had just realized that the world didn't operate as they had imagined. It wasn't always about just getting. It wasn't always about just asking and receiving. Not everyone would so easily shoulder their burdens. The employee politely approached and took the folder back from the table. Her voice was still polite, but there was no more time to wait. We apologize, but due to the payment delay, we are now releasing this unit for sale again. A simple sentence, but it was like a final, fatal blow. Heather stood frozen. Carol slumped into her chair, and Jacob, without reacting, just stood there, watching everything, as if watching a performance where, for the first time, he was no longer a spectator behind the scenes, but an actor. Pulled onto the main stage under the spotlight. No lines, no script, just the raw truth. And it was at that moment he understood that losing this condo wasn't the end, but the beginning. The beginning of having to stand on his own 2 feet. No support, no patience, just himself. Jacob's car sped away from the sales office as the afternoon faded. The sun was no longer harsh, turning a pale yellow, casting long shadows on the tiled asphalt. But inside the car, there was no warmth. Only a heavy, suffocating atmosphere, as if they had just gone through a storm without any preparation. And the scariest part wasn't losing the condo, but the emptiness of having nothing to lean on for the first time. Carol sat in the back seat, her arms crossed, her face stiff, her eyes staring out the window, but seeing nothing. It was as if what had just happened was replaying in her mind. Every word I said, every look from the people around them, every moment she felt stripped bare in public. Meanwhile, Heather sat next to him, her back against the door, her eyes swollen and red, her mascara smudged, her hair a mess from crying. Occasionally, she would take a sharp breath, trying to suppress the unending sobs. And Jacob sat in the driver's seat, his hands on the steering wheel, but not starting the car immediately. Because he knew, once the car started moving, they would have to face something even more uncomfortable than the sales office, the prying eyes of their neighbors. Go. Are you just going to sit there? What for? Carol finally spoke. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was full of annoyance, as if she was taking out her frustration on her son's silence. Jacob didn't answer, just quietly started the engine. The car slowly began to move, no one saying another word. In fact, the silence made everything heavier. Because in each of their minds, different thoughts were racing. But no one wanted to say them out loud. No one wanted to admit that everything had changed. The car passed through familiar streets, past street vendors, pedestrians, the honking of horns, everything was normal. But for the three people in the car, the world seemed to have changed a bit, no longer the same as before. As the car turned onto the road leading to their apartment complex, Jacob started to feel his heart beat faster. Not because he was tired, but because he knew that as soon as the car stopped in front of the lobby, the familiar gazes would appear. The neighbors who usually greeted each other would be different today. And sure enough, as soon as the car pulled up in front of the building, a group of people had gathered. Not a large crowd. Just a small group, enough to form a circle. Each with their own style. Some with hands on their hips, some with arms crossed, some holding phones, and some all in a sea, leaning against their cars. But they all had one thing in common, their eyes were glued to the car. The car door opened. Carol got out first. She hadn't even stood up straight. A familiar voice came from the side, not quietly. "Hey, Carol's back." The speaker was a neighbor from the floor below. She was famous for knowing all the gossip in the apartment complex. Her voice was always loud enough for the whole floor to hear. "I heard you were settling your son's divorce today." Yes, the question was asked casually, but the content was anything but light. Carol paused for a moment, then quickly put on a normal face. "Oh, it's just a small matter. Family business, nothing to talk about." Nothing to talk about. Another voice chimed in. Mr. Davis, from across the hall, holding a newspaper, his eyes narrowed. "I heard Alara was supporting all of you for the past 3 years. Now that she's gone, things must be tough, huh?" As soon as that was said, the atmosphere immediately changed. It was no longer polite conversation, but sharp-edged sarcasm. Heather, who had just gotten out of the car, her face flushed red. She lowered her head, not daring to look at anyone, and quickly walked into the lobby as if trying to escape. But the gazes followed her like small, sharp needles, pricking her with every step. Carol turned around, her voice rising. "Who said that? Don't speak nonsense. My daughter-in-law's business is private. No need for outsiders to interfere." But that very sentence made some people smile faintly. Not a broad smile, but a knowing one. Who doesn't know about this drama? Mrs. Rinnie shrugged. "I have a friend who works at the courthouse. She witnessed the whole thing." Alara blocked all 8 cards right on the spot. The mother and children were left speechless. Hearing the story, it's quite pitiful. The word pitiful was emphasized. It was unclear who she was pitying, but everyone understood. Carol couldn't take it anymore, her voice shot up. "What are you talking about? Pitiful what? She was my daughter-in-law. She had a dampiet. Responsibility. A responsibility." Another voice piped up. This time it was Mrs. Gable, who too, was usually quiet, but always direct. A responsibility to support her entire in-law family for 3 years, or a responsibility to give all her money to her mother-in-law for shopping? Tell me, if it were your own daughter, would you be willing? The question was like a punch to the gut. No hesitation, no preamble. Carol stood frozen, unable to answer, because for the first time, someone had put her in the opposite position. Jacob, who had just gotten out of the car, looked at the scene before him with a mixture of shame and pain. He wanted to say something, to explain, to stop all this talk. But as soon as he opened his mouth, he realized he couldn't say anything. Because what they were saying was the truth. All right, let's go inside." An older man spoke up, his voice gentler. "Family matters should be resolved internally. Talking about it outside like this isn't good." Although his words seemed to have calmed the atmosphere, people's gazes didn't waver. They continued to follow the 3 of them as they entered the building. As if they were watching a play they had heard about, had anticipated, and were now witnessing firsthand. The elevator door closed. The small space was silent, with only the hum of the machinery. Heather stood in the corner, facing the wall. Carol stood straight, but her hands were clenched. Jacob stood in the middle, staring at the numbers as the floors changed one by one, slowly but surely. And at that moment, he realized that what had happened in the sales office wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Because lost money could be earned back, but lost face was not so easily regained. The elevator door opened on the 3rd floor. The chime was very quiet, But it was enough to startle all three of them. It was as if it wasn't just a signal for the floor, but a sign that they had officially entered a familiar, but no longer peaceful, space. And as the door slid open, a long corridor, dimly lit by yellow lights, was revealed. Along with it were the eyes that had been waiting for, who knows how long. Needless to say, they knew the news had reached them before they did. Mrs. Rennie, Mr. Davis, Mrs. Gable, the people from downstairs were now in the corridor. As if there was some fascinating story, the distance between floors was no friles longer an obstacle. And what was so uncomfortable was not their presence, but the way they stood, not crowding, not making a sound, just silently staring. That very silence made everything heavier. Carol walked out first, trying to keep her back straight, her face normal, as if nothing had happened. But his steps were no longer as steady as before. Each step was a little slower, as if an invisible force was holding him back. Heather followed him, her head bowed so low, she could barely see the way. Her hands clutched the hem of her shirt, and Jacob walked last, his eyes darting across everyone before quickly looking away, unable to bear the stares. "You're home?" Mr. Davis's voice rang out. Not too loud, but clear enough for the whole corridor to hear. We all heard the story downstairs. No one answered. Not because they didn't hear, but because they didn't know what to say. "Alara is quite amazing, isn't she?" Mrs. Rennie chimed in, her tone half praising, half mocking. "One move and all 8 cards are gone. You surely didn't expect that, did you, Carol?" Carol stopped and turned, her eyes no longer able to maintain their calm. "Have you said enough?" Her voice was hoarse, but she still tried to raise it. "My family's business doesn't need outsiders to interfere." Mrs. Gable, who was leaning against the wall, looked at her for a moment, and then said softly, but firmly, "You say we shouldn't interfere in your family matters. But just now downstairs, you said Alara was ungrateful. We couldn't stand to hear that." The sentence was not loud but decisive. The corridor was silent for a moment. Heather gently pulled her mother's arm. "Mom, let's just go." But Carol brushed her off as if her anger had reached its peak. "If not ungrateful, then what? She married my son, ate and lived in my house for 3 years. Now she cuts off all contact with us. If that's not ungrateful, what is?" This time, no one laughed, no one interrupted. There was just a very clear silence. Then Mr. Davis stepped forward, leaning on a cane, and looked directly at Carol. "Carol, let me ask you a sincere question. In those 3 years, what did she eat? Of yours?" It was a very simple question, but it left Carol speechless. "Who owns the house you're living in? Who owns the car you're driving? Who pays for your monthly living expenses?" With each question, Mr. Davis's voice was not loud. But every word seemed to be placed firmly in Carol's mouth, giving her no chance to escape. Carol opened her mouth but couldn't speak. Heather stood beside her, her face pale, and Jacob was also there. This time, he didn't avoid it, but looked straight ahead, as if waiting for his own mother's answer. But the answer never came. And just at that moment, another voice came from the dacha end of the corridor. The voice wasn't loud, but it was enough for everyone to turn around. "Let me explain." Everyone turned in unison towards the source of the Capacis voice. A middle-aged woman stood there. Her posture was straight, she wore a second simple blouse, her hair was neatly tied in a bun, and her gaze was calm. My mother didn't need an introduction. Just by looking at her, everyone understood. The atmosphere immediately changed, no longer with murmurs, but with anticipation. She walked over, slowly but surely, not in a hurry, as if she had been preparing for this meeting for a long time. And when she stood face to face with Carol, she didn't raise her voice, didn't show anger, just looked at me directly, and said, "A moment ago, you asked if my daughter was ungrateful." Her voice was soft but clear. Carol froze. She didn't answer right away. My mother didn't wait. She continued. "For the past 3 years, how much money did my daughter give to your family? Do you remember? If not, let me remind you. A total of $1,283,000. The number was spoken without any hesitation, but it was enough to silence the entire corridor. Of that amount, you used over 600,000, your daughter over 4. 100,000, and your son over 500,000 to cover his business losses. My daughter bore the brunt of the losses. Each sentence was like a hammer blow, exposing an undeniable truth. You said my daughter ate and lived in your house. So I ask, who paid for the food? No one answered. No one dared. You said my daughter was ungrateful. I thank you for that. Then I ask, what did you ever do for her? The room was so quiet that only the faint whir of the ceiling fan could be heard. Carol took a step back. Not because she was scared, but because she couldn't stand firm. Heather, who was standing behind her, her tears started to flow again. Jacob stood still, not speaking, not reacting, but his gaze had changed. My mother didn't stop. She looked around and then said in a steady voice, I didn't come here to argue. I just came to say one thing. My daughter does not owe your family anything. On the contrary, it is your family that owes my daughter. No one said anything. No one argued. Because all the numbers had been laid out, clear and undeniable. She turned to Jacob. Her gaze wasn't angry, just disappointed. Jacob, you are a man. If you want to stand tall, stand on your own 2 feet. Don't let a woman support you and then turn around and blame her. Jacob bowed his head, saying nothing. Because this time, he had nothing left to say. My mother turned and left, not waiting any longer, not looking back. And as she walked out of the corridor, no one stopped her, no one asked any more questions. Because everything that needed to be said had been said, all that was left was silence, and 3 people standing there, with no defense left in the blank corridor. After my mother left, the heavy atmosphere still lingered, as if a cold wind had just blown through. There was no noise, no pushing, but it was enough for everyone standing there to feel clearly that something had just been exposed. Not with curses or arguments, but with numbers and facts. And because of that, the impact was even more undeniable, unbearable, and could only be accepted in silence. Carol stood there, her shoulders no longer straight. Her gaze was no longer on anyone, but fixed on the floor. It seemed that the patterns on the tiles under her feet had suddenly become more fascinating than the gazes of the people around her. Heather leaned against the wall, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if trying to suppress a tremor. And Jacob, he still stood in the middle. But this time, not as a mediator, but as someone who had been pulled out of their familiar comfort zone, forced to stand alone and face reality. No one spoke anymore, no one wanted to ask anything. The drama that had just unfolded was more than enough, but the silence didn't last long. Just as people began to disperse, a cell phone rang, not too loudly. But in the silence, the sound was so clear that everyone instinctively turned their heads. It was Jacob's phone. She glanced at the screen, an unknown number. She hesitated for a moment, then answered. Hello, her voice was hoarse. On the other end, a woman's voice sounded sweet, but a bit hurried. Mr. Jacob, it's Sienna. Hearing that name, Heather immediately looked up. Her eyes flashed with something strange. Not joy, not surprise, but a kind of vigilance. Meanwhile, Carol frowned slightly, trying to remember who that was. Jacob turned slightly, lowering his voice. Yes, what's up? Where are you? The woman's voice on the other end was faster. I've been calling you for a while, but you didn't pick up. What's wrong? Jacob glanced around and whispered, I'm at home. If you need anything, just tell me. The other end was silent for a moment, then the woman's voice lowered. Sir, it's about the money. Hearing the word money, Heather's eyes immediately darted to her brother. Meanwhile, Carol also turned sharply, as if sensing something was wrong. What money? Jacob asked. But his voice was no longer as confident as before. It's the money you transferred to me. Now my family is asking about it. The sentence was not finished, but it was enough to freeze the atmosphere. Heather took a step forward, her voice urgent. Sir, who are you calling? Jacob was startled and tried to cover the phone, but it was too late. Because the next sentence from the other end came through. You said you were divorced. That money was yours. How is it now someone else's? Sienna, lower your voice. Jacob interrupted. His voice was panicked, but the damage was done. Carol walked straight to him and snatched the phone from his hand. Who is this? Her voice rose. Who are you? The other end fell silent. Then, the woman's voice changed. No longer sweet, but wary. I'm a friend of Jacob's. What kind of friend uses money like that? Carol snapped. Explain yourself. Jacob quickly snatched the phone back. Mom, that's enough. He hung up, not giving the other person a chance to say more. But what was there left to hear? It had all been said. No one asked any more questions. It wasn't necessary. Because everyone understood, there was a story they had never known. Heather stared at her brother, her eyes wide. What money, Jacob? Who did you transfer money to? Her voice trembled, not with curiosity, but with fear. Jacob didn't answer right away. He looked at the floor, as if searching for an answer he himself didn't want to say. Answer me. Heather shouted. Where did you get the money to transfer to someone else? Carol also stared at him, her eyes sharp. Explain what's going on. There was no other way. Jacob took a deep breath and said. It was Alara's money. 3 short words, but they were like a lightning strike. What? Carol almost screamed. You gave her money to someone else. Heather took a step back. Her gaze shifted from disbelief to horror. Jacob, are you insane? Jacob closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them. Not just once, but many times. His voice grew smaller. Tens of thousands each time, totaling nearly 100,000. The air seemed to be sucked out of the room. No one breathed, no one spoke. The information was too shocking. Carol stood stiffly, her mouth agape, but not eating. Then suddenly, she raised her hand. Slap. A sharp slap landed on Jacob's cheek. Jacob didn't flinch, didn't resist, just took it. What have you done? His mother's voice was choked. That money was for the family. How could you give it to an outsider? Jacob didn't look at his mother, just said, it wasn't the family's money. It was Alara's. The same sentence was repeated. But this time, no one argued because they had just heard it from his own mouth. Heather shook her head, tears falling again. Jacob, you used Alara's money to support another woman. What were you thinking? Jacob didn't answer, because he didn't know. He only knew that at the time, he felt he could do it, because the money was always there. Just ask, just swipe, just wait. But not anymore. And the scariest part wasn't getting caught, but realizing that everything she had ever done was now coming back to haunt her bit by bit, leaving no trace. Carol slumped back into her chair, her hands trembling. Oh my God, what kind of date son have I raised? But this time no one comforted her, no one said. Be patient, Mum. Because everyone knew that question had an answer. It was just that no one wanted to say it. The corridor was silent again, but it was no longer a heavy silence, but the silence of something broken. Broken into pieces that could never be put back together. The atmosphere in the hallway, after the slap, was no longer just tense. It had become cold and suffocating. It was as if everything that had been left unsaid for the past 3 years had suddenly been brought to light at once, without sequence, without preparation, and without any way to take it back. It left everyone standing in an awkward silence, not knowing what to say, or how long they should remain silent. Jacob still stood in the same spot. His cheek was slightly red from the slap, but he didn't touch it, nor did he turn away. He just stood there like someone who had just woken up from a long dream. And when he fully woke up, he found that nothing around him was familiar. Meanwhile, Carol sat slumped in a plastic chair in the corner of the hallway, her head in her hands. Her once neat hair was now disheveled. A few strands fell, partially covering her face. But what was most striking was not her appearance, but her posture. A posture that no longer showed authority or control, but the exhaustion of someone who had just been dethroned from what they thought was their safest position. Heather stood beside him, no longer sobbing, but tears continued to stream down her face, without her knowing. Because there are times when you no longer feel your own tears, you just feel your heart getting emptier. The neighbors had not completely dispersed. They stood scattered along the corridor. No one spoke loudly, but their eyes were still fixed on the three of them. It seemed the drama wasn't over, and in fact, it wasn't. Because just as the atmosphere began to settle, another sound was heard. The steady sound of high heels from the end of the corridor, not rushed, not slow. Everyone turned. A woman appeared. She was slender, wearing a tight-fitting dress, her hair curled, her makeup heavy, and her eyes held a certain arrogance, as if it had become a seven. Abby. And when he stopped a few steps away from them, the atmosphere became tense. Again. Heather was the first to recognize him. "Who are you?" Her voice was hoarse, but she tried to remain calm. The woman didn't answer right away. She glanced around. Her eyes rested on Jacob for a moment, then she said in a soft but annoyed voice, "Your phone wasn't being answered. I had to come here." Just that one sentence was enough to say it all. Carol lifted her head, her eyes sharp. "Are you Sienna?" The girl was a little surprised, then nodded. Yes. She didn't deny it, didn't evade it. Just that one word was enough to connect all the events into a clear, coherent narrative. It was no longer a guess, but the truth laid bare before her. Heather looked at Jacob, then at Sienna, then back at Jacob. Her expression slowly changed. From confusion to understanding, then from understanding to bitterness. "So, you're the one?" Her voice grew smaller. "The one who received the money transfers from Jacob." No one answered. But the silence was clearer than any answer. Sienna frowned, looking around. Perhaps she hadn't expected to walk into this situation. She turned to Jacob, her voice soft. "Sir, what's going on? You said you were divorced and they..." She hadn't finished speaking when Carol stood up. Not quickly, but very decisively. She walked closer, stood in front of Sienna, sized her up from head to toe, and then asked, "Do you know whose money you've been using?" Sienna was a bit stunned, but quickly regained her composure. "Jacob's money?" It was a short and clear answer. But because of that, the few remaining neighbors glanced at each other. They had just heard the story before, and this answer didn't make sense. It was his money. Carol sneered. "Are you sure?" Sienna frowned. "What do you mean?" Carol didn't answer but turned to Jacob. "You explain to her where that money came from." Jacob stood still, saying nothing. Not because he didn't know, but because he didn't want to. "It was Alara's money." He finally said it. His voice was very soft, but loud enough for Sienna to hear. The girl was silent for a few seconds, as if not understanding whose money it was. "Alara," Jacob repeated. Sienna took a step back, as if she had just been gently pushed. Not by a hand, but by the truth. "You said you were divorced." His voice began to tremble. "You said the money was yours." "Divorced," Jacob said. "But the money was hers. I just took it to use." A very gentle explanation, but it felt very heavy. Heather laughed bitterly. "Just took it to use. You say it as if it were your own. You took my wife's money to support another woman." Sienna turned to Jacob, her eyes completely changed, no longer gentle, no longer trusting, but cold. "Is that true?" she asked. Not harshly, but sharply. Jacob didn't answer, but his silence was enough. Sienna took a deep breath, then smiled. It was a very faint smile, without any joy. "You're really something, Jacob. Using her money to tell me you love me. I even thought." She stopped, swallowed the rest of the sentence, then shook her head. "Forget it, no need to talk about it anymore." She turned, not looking at anyone, and walked away. The sound of her high heels echoed again, but this time it wasn't as steady as before. It was faster, more hurried, as if she wanted to leave this place immediately. The corridor was silent again. But this time, there was nothing left to say. Because everything was clear. The sound of Sienna's heels slowly faded, and disappeared at the end of the corridor. But the echo remained, not just in the air, but in the minds of everyone who stood there. Because that sound was not just the sound of someone leaving, but the sound of the end of a choice, a relationship, a belief that had felt so real. Just a few minutes before, Jacob still stood in the same place. His eyes followed Sienna's direction, but there was no hope or desire to hold on. All that was left was a vast emptiness, like someone who had just lost something whose value was only realized after it was gone. When Carol stood beside him, her gaze shifted from Sienna to Jacob, then from Jacob to the empty space in front of her. It was as if he was trying to piece together the pieces of information into a complete picture, but the more he pieced them together, the more he felt it was wrong and forced. And Heather. She leaned against the wall, no longer crying, but her face grew paler. It seemed her tears had run dry, leaving only a blankness. Coldness. No one said anything, not because they had nothing to say, but because so much had just happened that they didn't know where to start. The neighbors had now truly dispersed, not because the show was over, but because the story had reached a point where it no longer needed to be watched closely, just remembering it was enough. And in their eyes as they left, there was no more curiosity, but a mixture of understanding and a desire to keep their custody. Distance. The apartment doors closed one by one. The corridor became quieter, but that loneliness did not ease the atmosphere. Instead, it highlighted the isolation of the three remaining people. Carol was the first to speak, but her voice was no longer high-pitched, but hoarse and low. Jacob, just one word, but it was not the last. Jacob didn't turn around, nor did he answer. He still stood there. As if he turned back, he would have to face everything that had just happened. And right now, he wasn't ready. Look at me. Carol continued. This time, her voice was a precitavo. Little shaky. Jacob closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them and looked at his mother. His gaze was no longer averted, but it was no longer warm either. What do you want to ask me? He said, his voice even and emotionless. Your relationship with that girl? Carol said slowly, as if each word had to be carefully chosen. Since when? It was not a harsh question, but it was heavy. Jacob didn't answer right away. He looked at the floor and said, 2 months. Just 2 words, but enough to clarify many things. Heather laughed, a very faint but bitter laugh. 2 months. So, at that time, you were still living with Alara, still using her money to support another woman. No, one argued, no one refuted. Because the statement was too clear. Carol sat down on the chair, her head in her hands. Oh my God, this family is broken. But this time no one comforted her. No one said, be patient, Mom. Because they themselves could not calm down. Jacob stood still, then suddenly turned and walked towards the exit of the corridor. Where are you going? Carol looked up. Out, he answered briefly without hesitation. What do you want? Where are you going at this hour? His mother's voice began to panic. Jacob paused for a moment without turning back, just said, I need to think. Then he left without waiting, without looking back. The emergency exit door at the end of the corridor slammed shut behind him. A soft but firm sound. Only 2 women were left inside. A mother and daughter sat in the middle of a room that was once bustling with conversation, the sound of the television, and the sounds of life. But now, there was only a lingering silence. Heather looked at her mother and said softly, Mom, were we wrong? Yes, it was a very small question, but it was a question that no one had asked her for 3 years. Carol didn't answer right away. She still covered her face, sat there for a long time, and then sighed heavily. I don't know anymore. For the first time, she said she didn't know. It wasn't blaming her, nor blaming anyone else, but simply that she didn't know. Outside, Jacob walked down the emergency stairs, not taking the elevator because he didn't want to be in a confined space, didn't want to see his own reflection in the mirror, didn't want to be cornered. Each step he took down was slow, but steady. Each step seemed to be accompanied by a thought, a memory, a sentence. Everything was jumbled, but very clear. He remembered the times Alara gave him the card. The times Alara said, just use it. The times Alara never asked, never checked, never doubted, and he got used to it. All used to it. Until he took it for granted, familiar, and considered it his right. Until today, when everything was cut off, he finally understood. It wasn't because he owned it, but because Alara gave it to him. When he reached the gate, it was already dark. The streetlights came on, casting a yellow glow on the asphalt. Jacob stood there, not continuing, not turning back, just standing there, watching the traffic. People came and went, each with their own purpose. While he didn't know where he was, his phone vibrated. He looked down. Not Alara, not Sienna, but a notification from the bank. 2 bills were due, a credit card, and a personal loan. The amounts weren't large, but they were enough for him to realize that it wasn't over. This was just the beginning. A beginning with no one behind him, no one to shoulder the responsibility, no one to look to. Just himself and everything he had done. Jacob stood under the wedding ed. Jacob stood under the wedding astered. Jacob stood under the wedding ender scrad. Streetlight for a long time. He didn't even remember how many minutes or hours had passed. He only knew that the traffic in front of him continued to flow. People came and went, and he remained silent, like a forgotten shadow in the praso, midst of the hustle and bustle. And what bothered him was not the cold night, but the emptiness inside him. An emptiness that was previously filled with ordinary things. A woman who was always by his side, a wallet that was always full, and a home that always had hot food. Now it was all gone, not because it was taken away, but because he had not taken care of it. The phone in his hand vibrated again. This time it was not a notification, but a call from the office. He stared at the screen for a few seconds and then answered. His voice was still heavy and tired. Hello, Jacob. The manager's voice came through, not loud, but clearly there was a problem. See me in my office tomorrow morning. Yes, Jacob frowned. Is there a problem? With my work, sir? There was a moment of silence, then the voice on the other end lowered. You've been coming in late lately. Your quotas aren't being met. Clients have been complaining a lot. The company has given you a few warnings. We'll discuss it in more detail tomorrow. The call ended. Short but concise. Jacob lowered the phone and stared at the fading screen. The feeling of panic no longer invaded his mind, replaced by a crystal clear certainty. The consequences were not just one, but a chain of them coming. They gave him no time to adapt, no chance to delay. Because everything he had ever ignored, everything he had ever put off, was now coming back to him bit by bit. He sat on the sidewalk in front of the apartment complex gate. His hands were clasped together, his head bowed. And in that moment, for the first time in a long time, he didn't think about his mother, he didn't think about his sister, he didn't think about who was right or wrong. He only thought of one person. Alara was not his ex-wife, but the woman who had stood by him for 3 years. He remembered the nights she sat in front of his laptop, working late into the night, while he lounged on the sofa, playing with his phone. He remembered the times Alara secretly transferred money without asking, just saying simply, just use it. He remembered the times Alara wanted to say something, but looked at his mother, at the atmosphere in the house, and then stopped and chose to be silent. And that silence made him think that Alara accepted that there was no problem, that everything was fine. But it wasn't. Alara was silent until she finally stopped speaking altogether. She lifted her head, staring at the pitch-black night sky, without a single star. Only the faint glow of the city lights was visible. And suddenly, she realized something she had never thought of before. There are things that seem ordinary when they are in your hands, but when they are gone, you realize they were not ordinary at all, but rather a stroke of luck. He stood up, not going back right away, but walking out of the gate and into a small coffee shop by the roadside. He ordered an unsweetened iced tea and sat down, surrounded by workers who had just finished their shifts. The simple conversations, the laughter, the complaints about work, money, and life were all very real, very close, and it was these things that made him feel lonely. Because before, he never had to think about those things. Not because he didn't live in that world, but because someone else had taken on that responsibility for him. His iced tea arrived. He took a sip. The cool water flowed down his throat, but it couldn't soothe the dryness in his heart. Just then, his phone vibrated again. This time, it was a text from a familiar 7A number, Alara. He stared at the screen, not opening it right away, just looking at it for a moment before pressing the button. Jacob, no more drama. I've sent a summary of the past 3 years' expenses to your email. If you feel it's necessary, we can meet one more time to clarify things. Not to argue, but to end things properly. The message was short, emotionless, not blaming, and not at all sarcastic. But that's what made it so sharp. He read it twice, 3 times, then locked the screen, not replying immediately. Not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know how to react. Because he understood, this was not a chance to go back, but a chance to face it. He sat there for a while longer, then stood up, paid, and went home. This time, his steps were not as slow as when he went down. They were firmer. Not because he had found a solution, but because he knew he couldn't stay in one place. He couldn't wait for things to resolve themselves. He couldn't remain silent. He got into the elevator and looked in the mirror. For the first time, he didn't avoid it, but looked directly into the eyes of the person in the mirror. He stared at a man he wasn't sure he liked or not. The elevator door opened. He walked out. The corridor was the same, but there were no more people. No more stairs, just silence. He opened the door and walked in. Carol was sitting on the sofa, Heather beside her. They both stared at him, neither saying anything. Jacob closed the door, stood for a moment, and then said, "I'm going to meet Alara." His voice was not loud, but it was clear. Carol was stunned. "Why are you meeting her? What else is there to talk about?" Jacob looked at his mother. This time, his gaze did not waver. To end this, not to ask, not to regret, but to end it. Heather stared at her brother, saying nothing. But for the first time, there was no demand in her eyes, just weariness. Carol wanted to say something, but then she stopped. Because she also understood that some things could not be put off any longer. The next morning, when the supper second city had not yet fully woken up, the streets were still quiet, and the sun was just beginning to peek over the rooftops, Jacob left the apartment very early. It wasn't because he was used to waking up early, but because he knew that if he stayed any longer, heard one more sentence, or saw one more look in that house, he would doubt himself again. And this time he would not hesitate. Because there are things that, if not done with a clear mind, it is easy to fall back into the old cycle. He stood in front of the coffee shop whose address Alara had sent him the night before. It was a small shop on a street corner, not fancy, not crowded, but clean and quiet. The kind of place he rarely noticed before, because his meetings usually didn't require quiet, and he usually avoided important conversations. Today was different. He walked in, chose a table by the window, sat down, and ordered a black coffee. No sugar, no ice. While waiting, he looked outside. The streets were starting to get busy. The sound of traffic grew louder, the city's noise grew louder, but his heart grew calmer. It was as if everything was converging on a single point. A meeting he knew would be different from any before. Alara had arrived. Not early, not late. Right on time, he walked in. The light from behind cast his crostus long shadow on the floor. He still walked as before, his back straight, his steps firm. But there was something different. No more haste, no more hesitation, no more sense of caution that he had felt throughout their marriage. She saw that Jacob was not at all surprised. He just nodded slightly, then came and sat opposite her. "You're early," she said. Her voice was normal, not distant, but not intimate either. "Yes," Jacob replied. "I don't know what else to say." The waiter brought the food. Black coffee for him, hot tea for Alara. Neither of them touched their drinks directly, just stared, not at each other, but at the empty space between them. A place that once held so much, words, arguments, silence, patience. But now it was empty. Alara was the first to speak. She didn't beat around the bush. "Did you read the summary I sent?" Jacob nodded. "I did. Any comments?" He shook his head. "No." It was a short but sincere answer, because he knew the numbers were correct, indisputable, unchangeable, and there was no reason to deny them. Alara nodded slightly. "Good." She took a stack of papers from her bag and placed them on the table. "This is the printed version, with full details, dates, and notes. You can keep one." Jacob stared at the stack of papers, not taking it right away, as if looking back on 3 years of his life through numbers. "I'm not asking you to pay it back now," Alara continued, her voice still even. "But I need you to sign here to confirm and clarify things." There was no demand or coercion. Just to clarify it. Jacob took a deep breath and picked up the pen. He signed immediately, without hesitation, without delay. When he put the pen down, he knew this was not just a signature on paper, but a signature of agreement. Accepting what he had done, accepting the consequences, and accepting that there was no turning back. He pushed the paper towards Alara. Alara looked at it. She nodded and put it away. She didn't say thank you because there was no need to be silent anymore. But this time, the silence was not heavy, just empty. Jacob looked at her for a moment and then said, "I'm sorry." 3 words, not fancy, but it was the first time he had said them. Alara was not surprised, nor did she react immediately. He took a sip of his coffee and then put it down. "What are you sorry for?" It was a simple question, but not easy to answer. Jacob bowed his head, thought for a planned moment, and then said, "For taking everything you did for granted, for not protecting you, and for using your money on someone else." With each sentence spoken, he felt a little lighter but also a little more aware. Alara listened without interrupting, without nodding. She just listened and then said, "You know, what I need is not an apology." Jacob looked up. "Then what? Understanding?" Alara replied. "As long as you understand, that's enough. No need for forgiveness, no need to go back, just understanding." Jacob nodded. "Now I understand." It was a sentence, but this time it wasn't just an act, it was real. Alara looked at him, her eyes no longer cold, but not warm either, just normal. "Then that's enough," she said, and stood up. "No waiting, no dragging it out any longer. Let's end it here." It wasn't a question, but a conclusion. Jacob also stood up, not resisting, not begging, just saying, "Yes." Alara took her bag and walked towards the door. The light from outside shone on her. She walked out without looking back. And this time Jacob didn't look at her for long. He just stood there for a moment, then sat down, staring at his cold cup of coffee. He picked up the coffee, took a sip, bitter but sobering. After that meeting at the coffee shop, things didn't end with any great drama or further surprises. Everything concluded in silence, like a door closing behind someone, soundlessly, without witnesses, but clearly signaling that two paths would no longer cross. And it was that very silence that made everything more memorable, leaving not a 7 a 10 dramatic image, but a very real feeling. The feeling of having lived through a chapter of life that could never be repeated. Alara returned to her life. Not a completely new life, but the life she once had, which she had put on hold during her 3-year marriage. She returned to work at a steady pace. She didn't push herself too hard to forget the past, nor did she let herself relax to the point of negative thinking. She chose a balanced path. Working in the morning, going home in the tedious evening, occasionally meeting friends, and visiting her mother on weekends. These were simple things, but they gave her a peace she realized had been missing for a long time. There were nights when she would sit alone by the window, watching the traffic below, and she would still remember him. Not as a husband, but as a phase, a version of herself that once existed. A woman who knew how to be patient, to endure, and to sacrifice without asking for anything in return. And when she remembered him, she no longer felt regret or heartache. She felt content because some experiences are not meant to be held onto, but to be understood, then let go of to move forward. Her mother would occasionally ask, her voice a mixture of pity and curiosity, "Aren't you sad?" Alara would smile faintly. "Not anymore, Mom." Not to please her mother, but because it was the truth. Because she understood that the greatest sadness is not separation, but staying in a place where you are not appreciated. And once you have successfully walked out of it, the rest is just a matter of time to rebalance your life. Jacob's life, on the other hand, did not change immediately. There was no instant transformation, but a series of very real, very slow, and sometimes very uncomfortable days. Because this was the first time in years that he had to face things he had never had to deal with on his own before. His work was evaluated not once, but several times. After the meeting with his superior, he was not fired, but his major clients were redirected. He was moved to smaller projects with lower revenues. This forced him to change. Not because he wanted to, but because he had no other choice. He started arriving on time, taking notes on his work, and learning to talk seriously with clients. The things he used to find tedious even in the Teventers evenings, he no longer came home to a prepared dinner table. Often, he had to cook for himself or eat whatever he could buy at fast food joints or drive-thrus. The food was simple, not delicious, but enough to fill his stomach. And it was at times like these that he remembered the meals he used to eat so carelessly. He ate without asking who cooked. He left half of it without thinking about the person who made it. The debt he signed with Alara was not small, and he could not afford to pay it all back at once. So, every month, he would transfer a portion of the money, not much, but regularly. And every time he transferred the money, he no longer felt it was an obligation, but a way to remind himself that everything he did had consequences. And accepting to pay was not a loss, but a lesson learned. Carol also changed. Not because she was forced to, but because she had no one left to rely on. She started going to the market herself and calculating her expenses. There were no more impulsive shopping sprees, no more extravagant spending trips like before. And when she sat alone at home, she gradually understood that the things she had taken for granted had never really existed. Heather too. She started working. It wasn't a big job, just a normal office job with a modest salary. But it was enough for her to support herself. And for the first time, when she received her salary, she understood that earning money was not the same as spending it. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't something to be taken lightly. Their family was no longer as busy as before, no more loud voices, no more constant demands. They became quieter, not cold, but understanding. Everyone did their part, without expectations, without demands, and that change, though late, was necessary. As for Sienna, she never appeared again, no calls, no texts. It seemed that the Pricey meeting that day was enough for her to understand her place in this story. And leaving was the right choice, no further explanation needed. Time passed, not quickly, but not slowly either. Enough for what had happened to settle down. Enough to help anyone find their rhythm of life again. And one afternoon, when Jacob was standing under the same streetlight as that night, but with a lighter heart, he realized something that he might have had to pay a high price to understand. Some people leave not to punish you, but to teach you how to stand on your own 2 feet. And that loss is not the end, but the beginning of growth. If you look back at this whole story from beginning to end, I think the most moving thing is not the divorce or the money issue, but how a relationship that could have been normal and warm gradually became a burden and eventually broke down in coldness. As for Alara, I don't think she was strong from the start. No one gets married preparing to suffer. She was just an ordinary woman who trusted her family, her husband, and was willing to sacrifice. But her mistake was giving too much without setting boundaries. There are things that if we don't keep for ourselves, others will feel entitled to take them. When Alara left, many might have called her cruel. But that was when she started to treat herself fairly. As for Jacob, I don't think he was a bad person from the start, but he was the type of person who is very dangerous in a marriage. He was not entirely wrong, but he was not entirely right either. He chose to be silent to avoid conflict, chose to mediate to keep the peace, but by not taking a side, he ended up hurting the people closest to him. A husband doesn't need to be perfect, but he must have a stance. When the woman beside him is hurt and he is silent, the price to pay is only a matter of time. And for my mother-in-law and Heather, their story is a very real lesson in gratitude. When you are used to accepting without thinking, using without asking, and taking others' sacrifices for granted, when you lose not only money, but also respect. The scariest thing is not poverty, but when others look at you with contempt. Things shouldn't have been this way. This story is not meant to judge anyone, but to help us look at ourselves. In a relationship, are you the Alara who gives too much, or the Jacob who chooses to be a mediator and avoid responsibility? Or are you the one who is used to receiving and forgets gratitude? If there is one thing this story conveys, it is that love does not mean unconditional endurance. And family is not a place where one person carries all the burdens while the other just watches. Everything is only sustainable when there is balance, respect, and clear boundaries. And you, if you were in Alara's situation, would you choose to persevere or to stop at the right time?